Glad to welcome into the show. Courtney Cronin does a great job for ESPN.com, covers the Minnesota Vikings. Joining us now. Courtney, how you doing?
Hey, Jacob, I'm good. How are you?
Doing well. Thanks for hopping on with us. We truly appreciate it. Great write-up there on Justin Jefferson. Of course, we all know him as Jets down here in Baton Rouge. And so the first question I have for you is, how was it received by the Vikings fans whenever they took Justin Jefferson in the first round?
I mean, you couldn't have asked for a better pick. When Philly's on the clock at 21, I think everybody was collectively holding their breath. I know that the Vikings were, and there was a major sigh of relief from Minnesota when the Eagles took Jalen Reagor from TCU. They were in a position that they were prepared to trade up, and Philly, from my understanding, was willing to engage in that trade if the Vikings were going to pick a defensive player, but they ended up taking the receiver that the Vikings, that's not who their target was at that position. Being able to get the top slot receiver in college football last year and arguably in the draft was huge, because you had 22nd pick from Buffalo to begin with because you traded Stephon Diggs, and that's one of the 4 picks that you got in exchange for him, and they turn right around and get his replacement in Justin Jefferson. So very much a win-win scenario. I know that given how deep this draft class is, or was at receiver, that some people had anticipated, and kind of the school of thought was, well, maybe they could wait until day 2 and they could get another high-value pick somewhere at that 58 range. They could trade up potentially. But when Justin Jefferson was there at 22, they didn't overthink it. They went right in, they got him, and they're able to continue building their offense right where they left off.
The Vikings trade Stephon Diggs to Buffalo, so Adam Thielen's probably going to be asked to be the number 1 receiver, and I would assume Justin Jefferson comes in, and Adam Thielen probably plays more of an outside receiver, and Jefferson is in the slot, or how do you think that works out?
That's interesting, because that's a million-dollar question here. We actually are going to hear from Thielen tomorrow on a Zoom call. I'm curious what his thoughts are, because he was so successful in the slot, and when Jefferson was drafted, I remember, that was the first question that I was getting from fans on social media. Well, what about Thielen? Thielen can play outside. I mean, he just, primarily last year, in the way that the offense has been, played in the slot. And a lot of that had to do with what Diggs was doing on the other side. Different offensive coordinators, they've been through a lot of them, from Diggs' rookie year in 2015 to where he was at in 2019. He played outside, inside, outside, inside. I mean, he was all over the place. And he had no qualms about that, but that really gave Thielen flexibility to go win those routes over the middle of the field and, frankly, freed him up for a lot of one-on-one matchups. Now, that's going to be the interesting part. Like, when Justin Jefferson can actually prove that he's a threat at the NFL level to take some of that attention away from Thielen's going to be doubled a hell of a lot going forward. So that's going to be interesting territory, because we saw a situation where Diggs wasn't playing the last few seasons due to injury, where Thielen was not successful at all because teams were, using bracket coverage and, truly in certain ways setting 2 defenders on him at all times. So I would anticipate that they'll probably want to move Thielen outside, but I'm not necessarily certain that the Vikings are dead set on Thielen becoming a true outside receiver, because they believe that, Justin Jefferson had 100 catches out of the slot last year. 100 of those 111 receptions came from inside. They still think he can play outside. He did it as a sophomore and had 900 yards in the SEC, which is more than Jarvis Landry and Odell Beckham did as sophomores. So, I mean, he certainly is capable of doing that.
Courtney Cronin's our guest here, hanging with Hester. You can follow her on Twitter at Courtney R. Cronin. Courtney, the narrative down here a lot of the season was that Ed Orgeron was passed over for a dream-ish job at USC, and Joe Burrow was a bench player that nobody wanted, and Clyde Edwards-Helaire was a guy that nobody wanted, and it was this underdog story. And Justin, which one?
Ricky, all of them.
No, Justin was kind of lumped in there, but I never really heard him talk about that. When you spoke with him, did you sense a chip on his shoulder?
Yeah, I mean, I had asked him the night he was drafted, well, why'd you move into the slot? And, taking a look at kind of the success that he had there, he said that he had never really played inside before. And that was something that he credited Joe Brady with, that once they hired Brady and they brought in some of those NFL spread concepts where you're going 5 wide and you're not, think about it from a few years ago. Like when I was down in Mississippi when I used to work down there, is when Les Miles was the coach at LSU. it's amazing to me to think about. And even speaking with Jordan Jefferson, like you brought up his name, of how different that offense was 5, 6, 7 years ago compared to where it is now. And for someone like Justin Jefferson, he's a byproduct of that. And that's not to take any sort of, notoriety or any of his accomplishments away from what he did as the last 2 years of his college career. But, the offense is a huge reason for success. I mean, having a quarterback who's able to place the ball where he did is a huge reason Justin Jefferson was so successful, but also the offense played to their strengths. I mean, they were a team that played deep in the postseason. They won a national championship. They had a ton of exposure, and I think that Justin Jefferson very much realizes that, and how that kind of shaped his journey from becoming this unknown guy to somebody who was ready to leave after his third year.
Courtney, we always talk about how funny it is that Justin Jefferson's nickname is Jets, and people were worried about what his 40 time would be. And, of course, he goes out and runs a 4.43 at the Combine. But, doing this story, I'm sure you learned that's really been the story of him his entire life. And, look, I can appreciate it. I was a 2-star recruit as well that came to LSU and tried to find a way to get to the NFL. Same thing that Justin did. And then he goes out there and he becomes the first round pick in 8 years that came in as low rated a recruit as he was. And so I think he still plays with that chip on his shoulder. Did you get that sense talking to him?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's still kind of like this sense of awe for him of like, holy moly, I can't believe I made it here after 3 years of college when he didn't play his freshman year. I mean, he had like one rush for 4 yards. He didn't even catch a pass, and he arrived late. He was the last member of that 2017 class to get to campus. And I really think that, in speaking with his father and people around the situation, that Jerry Sullivan, who was at that time in that consultant role before he became the passing game coordinator, really took Justin under his wing and saw something special. Because, when I cover it, the story kind of brought me back because I used to cover recruiting for the Clarion Ledger in Jackson, Mississippi from 13 to 16. So I knew the game. I knew about the star process and the ranking process, and sometimes you get guys who just fall through the cracks. Jonathan Abram, who was a first-round pick out of Columbia, Mississippi, a prime example of that. He was a guy that nobody knew about. And then he ends up gray shirting, going to Georgia, and then gets to Mississippi State and becomes a first-round pick. Those stories they're kind of few and far between, but they're not as unheard of as you would think of. So I think a guy like Justin Jefferson, who had all of the pieces, he just, like many of these guys who aren't 5-star recruits, are late developers. And that's okay because, a lot of the credit goes to coaching. And when you get into a program that's a good fit for you and you're not just buying into recruiting promises and you're able to develop, I think that certainly helped his case. And, it's kind of a whirlwind because before he, to my knowledge, he's up in Minnesota now. But he left on Friday, but for, the couple weeks there after the draft, he was back at home, working out with a jugs machine. Teams were allowed to send a specific monetary amount of, weight room equipment to players so they could work out on their own. And, speaking with his father about it, it's kind of like everything coming full circle. Like you get drafted and you're in your childhood home and then you start basically your NFL career working out in the backyard. I don't think that's hit Justin yet, just from the people that I spoke with.
Courtney Cronin, our guest here on Hangin with Hester. Courtney, you've touched on a couple times your time in Mississippi. I'll take you back there for a second. What do you think the dynamic between these two head coaches is going to be moving forward with Lane Kiffin and Mike Leach?
Man, I would love to be down there right now covering that. That would be an absolute, blast. The Leach hire, I remember when that happened, I was, I didn't believe it at first. I thought it was, from a fake Twitter account. I was like, there's no way. And then I see it, and I was just like, oh, my goodness. And then, Lane obviously has had ties to Ole Miss. His brother Chris was the defensive line coach there when I covered Hugh Freeze and the Rebels back, in the, 2013 to 16 time. So I guess I wasn't too surprised. His name had always been floated for that job, ever since, the fallout with Freeze. But that's going to be fun. And you know what? Like the last time, I realize I'm speaking to a Baton Rouge audience right now, and I won't offend people because anytime I go on Mississippi radio and you even suggest in the slightest that they're not relevant, my Twitter mentions go out of control. But this will make them relevant again. People are going to care because you know what? That 2014 season was fun as hell to cover. When I was in Oxford the day that they beat Alabama, and it was the same day that Mississippi State beat Texas A&M, and I was at State covering the Auburn game the day the State went to #1 when they beat them. I mean, that was a really fun time. And when, the 2 Mississippi cover on Sports Illustrated was awesome. I remember some of my best memories covering football as a journalist. And I think that obviously the programs still have a way to go. I'm not, as up to date on recruiting and, what their classes look like. I know that nationally, though, the coaches and the personalities that they have are certainly going to draw some fans nationally who probably wouldn't be looking at those 2 programs, which are, by and large, middle of the pack in the SEC West.
Courtney, not many times can a game that ended with an Ole Miss player fake urinating and getting a 15-yard penalty be one-upped, but I feel like we're going to get that this year in the Egg Bowl.
I mean, you got it twice in 1 year, right? Like there was a State player who did it last year because you saw DK Metcalf do it the year before. Or an Ole Miss player did it, and DK did it the year before. I mean, it never ends. That rivalry is something else. I definitely know it's like it's a religion down there. But it's a lot of fun. I definitely, some of my best memories covering football came from my time in Mississippi, specifically with those 2 programs. But I've loved covering games down at LSU too. I remember when State beat LSU in 2014. When Dak was starting to become a quiet name in the Heisman race, how loud that place was watching Dak stiff arm whoever it was when he ran in that touchdown. Yeah. That was something to see.
I believe it was Jalen Mills, and I definitely remember that game. That was a weird game, and then LSU made a comeback, but credit Mississippi State because that was a very big time game and a big time moment. Courtney, this has been a lot of fun. I appreciate you. By the way, we have the Bayou Ford Huddle, and a lot of people in the state of Mississippi listening now said you did a great job covering both those schools and as well as high school football, so you're getting a lot of shout-outs.
It was a lot of fun. That was I'll always say that was some of the best years that I've ever had as a journalist, and it set me up to where I'm at now. I definitely would never want to go back to Tiger Stadium, though, having a migraine. I covered a migraine, the Ole Miss game, I believe, in 2014, a couple weeks later, when Bo Wallace walked off the field.
Yeah, he left early.
Time on the clock. Yeah. You guys remember that? I had vertigo. And there's no worse place to be than in Death Valley, having a migraine where you feel like your head's about to explode out of your ears. So I hope that never happens to any of you guys, but would love to go to a game as a fan someday. I mean, that is just one of the coolest environments ever, and I felt very fortunate to have time to have done that before.
Fair enough. If you come to an LSU game, we'll make sure that it is done right. Courtney Cronin, we can't thank you enough. Again, the article is on ESPN.com, how Justin Jefferson went from a 0-star recruit to a Vikings first-round pick. It's a must-read. Courtney, thanks again.
No problem. Thanks, guys.